Yum, yum!
Greg here from Pixel Fondue. In this video, I'm going to talk about the new decal system in MODO 16.1. It's rather deep, and this is just going to be, I think, three parts. One, I'm just going to throw some decals on here so you can get an idea of the basic workflow. And then I'm going to dive into the mesh operation that actually creates the decals. And like I said, it's actually fairly deep. The decals in MODO, they're not just some image projection. They're actually creating geometry and UV mapping that geometry through some Boolean functions. And then, of course, you can bake those down at the end of the day, which I'll also get to in sort of the last part of the video, I guess. So, again, this is more of a preview than a tutorial, but it's worth watching. It's an interesting system, and yeah, it's kind of exciting. So, I'll throw some decals on this. These are just this and this wall are just some kit bash objects I bought from, I think, ArtStation or Flipped Normals. Well, you can also see the new curvature shading, viewport shading really nicely here in MODO 16.1. So like this is just one edge, but you get that sort of nice curvature look there, almost like a rounded edge shading. And some people like to model like that, so that's on there. And let me just show you the wall as well. So again, yeah, you can kind of see that curvature shading on there. It looks pretty cool. And so let's look at the decals. So a decal in this new system is actually geometry. So this is just a plane. So if I have decal A selected here, and we'll look at the shader tree. So it's just a plane, right? With a UV map. And let me just, right there, one polygon, 0 to 1 space. And there's a couple ways you can make decals. In this one, I've got a diffuse color here, right? Again, these are just decals I bought from again, ArtStation or Flip Normals. And then I've got this black and white image here, and that's set to stencil. So there you go. That's one way to do it. Let's look at decal B. This is another decal. This one is a little bit different. It just uses one image. In this case, it's using an RGBA effect right here. And what that does is it takes the RGB, puts it on diffuse color, and it takes the alpha from the built-in alpha on the ping or PNG file, and it makes a stencil out of that. So it's just one image, and it's color and stencil combined into one. Decal C here, and again, you make your decals manually. You just throw on a plane, throw on your images. There's your decal. This one is a normal map, so you can kind of see the bumps there, right, or the sort of 3D look of it. And again, this normal is just bought from a pack you can get. And then what I did is I just duplicated that normal texture. It's a ping with a built-in alpha. So to make the stencil, I just selected alpha only. It's typically on use. That's the default nature. You just put alpha only. MODO will just look at the alpha channel, and then I invert it and turn that to stencil, and that'll stencil out around the normal map there. And then the last one is more like something you would find on Quixel or like Substance Painter. This has quite a few different image maps on here. It's got a roughness map and a stencil and a normal and a diffuse color. You can kind of get in here and see the normal map a little bit, some of the roughness. So yeah, so normals or the decals can be really simple, just one image, or they could be rather complex like this one, this blood splatter with just as many image maps or material settings as you want. And it'll take material settings into account as well. Like the screw is taking into account the material settings, so it's got sort of a metallic material with no diffuse, 100% specular, and you can adjust the specular color if you want. Let's make it sort of maybe a sort of a copper looking rivet there or something like that, right? Okay. So, and this comes into play later when we get into baking, because MODO will actually be able to bake not just the image maps, but it'll be able to bake material properties as well. All right, so let's just look at sort of a basic workflow for adding decals. So I'm just going to pop this guy up here. This has no UV maps on it. It's just, we're going to place some decals. So there's a nice little tool here, and I think this will be the way most people do it. Is under Create, you just see this little decals button. Hit that. You set your target mesh. In this case, it's this pod here, and then select the decal you want to paint on it. And I'll just do decal A. Hit OK, and it goes into this mesh paint tool, right? And so it defaults to slide. I tend to like drop, where you can just adjust the scale. You can see here the target mesh is pod, and the item is decal A. That's what we're painting. And you'll see there's a whole folder of stuff put over here. Now, I'm going to get to this later once I talk about the mesh operation and what's going on. But as you use this, you don't really need to know all this stuff. It's good to know it so you understand what MODO is doing, but really you can just start painting, right? Now, one thing you want to notice is that this pod here, this mesh, is at 0, 0, 0, so it's at the origin. It's at 100% scale. These are the item transforms. You don't want it to have a whole bunch of item transforms or rotations or scales on it. You want everything zeroed out because the mesh paint tool is going to look at that, at that rest position there when you're painting, and if you have it moved off, it's not going to work. So you want it at the zero. You want everything zeroed out there in the item transforms, and then you just click this little button here called Decals, and you pick your the object you want to paint on. In this case, the pod, and you pick the decal you want to use. I'll use Decal A, and hit OK. And now our mesh paint tool is active. Okay, there's all the different modes are supported: slide, strokes, drop. I actually like drop. I can show you slides as well. You can see over here that the pod is the target mesh and the item that we're painting is Decal A. And you see there's a folder created over here. Now, you don't have to know how all this works behind the scenes, but I am going to go through it just so you can sort of wrap your head around it. But I think, as people start using this, you don't really need to know all this. You should just be able to, select what you want to paint on, select the decal you want to paint, and go to work. And not really have to worry about all the stuff going on behind the scenes. So I could just drag and click and rotate my stylus and get my little skull on here, my Decal A skull on here like this, and however I want it, and it looks good. And if I want to edit it, I can go over to edit mode and I can just sort of drag it around or rotate it if I want to, whatever. And go back to standard mode, and I can just find another place and paint another one like this, right? And I can go back to, like I said, I've got slide, which allows me to just drag anywhere. Or I also have drop is the other mode I like, which allows you to just sort of scale and rotate. It'll just put it where you want. Although when you let go, you can actually, like I said, go into edit mode and drag it around. So it doesn't have to be perfect. You'll see it sort of going over this curve here, and you see a little bit of deformation, and that's what we're going to talk about in a minute here. You see how that just goes right over that curve there? So what's happening is there's geometry being created. In fact, if I hide my pod, I see all these decals still existing. They're in this folder here. So actual geometry is being created, and UV maps are being created with a mesh operation when you make these decals. It's not just some texture projection in the shader tree. All right, so let's take a look at the mesh operation a little more in depth and see some of the options we have here. So I'm going to hide the pod. I'm going to hide these decals we've created. I'm going to bring on a procedural object here. So this is a sphere. It has a couple of mesh operations on there. It's got the sphere mesh. It's got a bevel to pull out that ring, and it's got a little bit of an edge bevel on that ring as well that you can see. Okay. And then I'll use Decal B with that RGBA image on it. And I can just pull it out, take a look at it. It's right there. So your decals don't have to be at 0, 0, 0. They will be moved around. They'll act as sort of projectors. And but this guy, when you're painting on, you do want it 0, 0, 0 again. And I've got a empty mesh item here called Decal Mop. And this is where I'm going to create the decal. It's a mesh operation, right? So it's fully procedural. So I could just, actually I could just hit tab in MODO 16.1 and type in decal. Decal planar is what we want. Same thing, you just pick your, as the button over here on the side, you pick the object you want to put the decal on, the sphere. Pick the decal you want to use, Decal B. We just leave everything else at default. You can adjust everything later, hit OK. You'll notice a couple things happen. When we've got the mesh op here with a bunch of operations, our decal turned into a bounding box, so we don't see it. And then, so I'm going to use a drop action called place and align. If you just take your decal and you hover and drag, you can use place and align, and it'll transform that decal onto there. Now I can take a look at this mesh operation, and I've got some view options here. One is box, that's the bounding box. We can actually show the decal. That's just our Decal B mesh that we used place and align. What it did is it just sort of rotated it and aligned it to the polygon we dropped it on, right? And I'm just going to go back to the mesh op, and I can show it as a bounding box, or I can hide it all together. But I'm going to keep it as a bounding box because it's going to be useful for us to look at. And again, this is just sort of a projection. It's almost like a texture projection, a texture locator, right? So I can do things like rotate it. I could just, go into mini props there and hit 90. I can also scale it. And you'll see some interesting stuff happening, right? So it's being rotated and scaled on here, but you see a little bit of a couple look like artifacts. And that's where this procedural nature comes in. I come over here to the mesh operation, and I can type in a tiny little bit of an offset. So right now we have what's happening is it's projecting this decal onto the surface of the sphere. It's creating a Boolean operation, so it's creating actual geometry. If I actually want to click, I can click those polygons. That's the geometry that's being created. You can kind of see how that's being projected there. And then it's creating a UV map for that as well. You can see it's created this UV map for that image to go on. So I can go in and I can adjust these things, right? It's a mesh operation. So I can turn on the offset, just offset it by like a millimeter. We could sort of fix that, right? There you go. So it's just laying on the surface. I can also go in and if I want to, I can adjust the UV map a little bit. I can go from relaxed mode from straight to angle based and maybe get a little bit better wrap there. And I can turn up my UV relax a couple times, like I want, or turn it down, whatever works best. So there's a lot of options. Yeah, so that looks pretty good. And like I said, it's procedural. So I can go back to my sphere and I can adjust my polygon bevel, right? And the decal goes with it. It's creating procedural geometry on top of procedural geometry. So I can adjust my edge bevel as well. You can see that Boolean operation. You can actually see the UVs in here changing, right? See the UVs changing? So, like I said, it's pretty involved. It's a pretty interesting system, and it gives you a lot of flexibility. And I can even, freeze this and just manually move points around if I want to. It's just geometry, and this decal mop here is just geometry. And it's sitting, if I isolate it, it's just sitting on its own, it's just sitting there above this layer. And so the next thought is, of course, can you bake it? And of course you can, and I'll get to that in 1 second. But that's just the general idea. So you look at this decal mop here, we just created one decal mesh operation. We placed and aligned it. We put it where we wanted it to. I can even, select this guy and let's say go to origin axis center and then just go to my rotate tool and move it around this way. It's doing all the Booleaning and UVing in real time, right? Look at the pod again, and let's look at this group here, and we can see what's going on with this. So let me open up a schematic, close this, and unclick this folder here. So there's a number of things happening. So what the mesh paint brush does is it actually places points. And so if I unclick this here, you'll see I have a point cloud. And if I go into vertex mode, I can grab these points, and you can hopefully you can see there are these points there. Maybe I'll just turn on, I don't know what the best way to do this is. Turn on the pod there. You see the points there at the center of each one of these. So these points have vertex maps, and the particle map, this transform map, includes all the rotation and scale and transform information on there. So I can even go do things like I could just select this point right here in a transform map, and I could use my scale tool. Let me just go to automatic action center, and I can scale that point if I want to, and it'll scale down that decal, right? So there's a lot of flexibility in there. So if I just drag these into the workspace over here, you'll see the particle source are those points that we painted using the mesh paint tool, and the decal A, this decal right here, let's isolate it, is replicated to all those points, right? And that's how we get these objects here replicated, okay? Those replicated decals are then merged together right here. So again, this is just the replicated decals merged together. They haven't been Booleaned yet. They haven't been, the mesh operation hasn't been applied yet. But that's where this final part of the piece right here comes on. And this does the mesh operation. So just like we had in our singular mesh operation over here, right, where we pick one source object, a decal, and one object to paint onto. We've got our target, which is our pod. We've got our source, which is all the merged replicas. So all those replicas we painted on merged into just geometry. And then those are Booleaned and UV'd onto that pod mesh. And here we have a bunch of them, right? So this is what's going on behind the scenes. Hopefully that's easy enough to follow. It's actually fairly easy. You may have to actually go in there and sort of take a look at it yourself, just so you can wrap your head around what's going on. Because like I said, there's a number of things going on behind the scenes. But at the end of the day, I think you're just going to be taking an object like this guy here, and you're going to be taking a decal and you're going to be painting things on. And pick the item they want to paint on and pick the decal they want to use. And they'll just go in and, right click for your size, and you can just drag around. A little bit bigger blood splat than that, I think, if Xenomorph came through here. And you can just, put those on the wall just like that. And you can use your edit mode if you want to sort of rotate them around a little bit. Or move them around. Now the last thing we want to do is bake these on, right? So we want to bake these guys onto just one texture. So we'll turn the pod back on. Look at some of these decals I painted earlier. Now, again, keep in mind, these are all on their own, these are separate geometry pieces, right? All on their own mesh item. And we want to bake these down into a texture on the pod. So I can go over here to my shader tree, and on my pod, I can right click and say create surface probe. This is a new tool to generate, probe surfaces of the decals that are applied close to the surface of this mesh. And I think it does some ray casting and it creates a texture. So we'll just say create surface probe. We have our target group, which is our pod here. We want to pick our decal A group here, right? Decal A. And we'll hit OK. And you'll see that what it did is it put a bunch of different textures in the library here. This is just so you only have one layer up here in the shader tree. What the library is, it's not used that much in MODO. I don't think people use it that much, but it's actually super useful. You can put a whole bunch of stuff down here. These are all just separate layers for roughness and specular amount and diffuse amount, stencil, diffuse color, everything that makes up this these decals here. And it just instances those into this single layer right here. So what I want to do is I want to make sure that this decal mesh is visible, it's turned on so that ray casting can be done, but I don't want it to render. So under the render drop down here, just hit no, make sure it's on no so it doesn't render. But that it is actually on. And if I pop open a preview over here and hit go, now you can see the skulls aren't actually the geometry of the decals being rendered. They're a texture within the pod mask being created dynamically with this surface probe. And you can see a little bit of the yellow down here. The probe has some controls on it as well, so it has a maximum depth. It's just looking like how close are these decals to the surface. And these are actually really close, within like 1 millimeter off the surface. Now remember in the mesh op, like what we did before, we can, push them on and off the surface. So the surface probe is just looking to see how close they are. It comes with sort of a maximum depth of 1 meter, which I think is way too high. I'm just going to put that down to like 5 millimeters. And you're going to see that yellow down there disappear. Just like now, you can bake this too. So if I just, you have to make sure there's UV maps. So if I come over here and look at the UV, there's a UV map on my little piece of geometry here. And I'm just going to preview the bake with a bake camera. So let me go back to the preview and hit go. And then over here in the little gear, I'm going to turn the renderer to the bake option, render mode. And we're going to see this texture baked out on the UV map. So there's the bake over on the left-hand side. And you could just use, that's the bake preview, I guess. You could just use MODO's standard baking tools to bake that to a map of whatever size you want. So the gist of it is MODO's decals in 16.1 are really flexible. So they're mesh operations, they're fully procedural. They create real-time booleans of the meshes you're putting them on and real-time UV maps, which can be relaxed, and you can change the UV map creation technique. You can change the offset. You can do all that stuff procedurally. And then you can freeze them if you want to and edit them manually. You can bake them down into textures. You can paint them on with the mesh paint tools. You can project them on sort of manually. And there's a lot there. And like a lot of the newer tools introduced, I think this needs to continue to be iterated on, needs to be faster. I think the mesh paint tool could be improved a little bit. And I'd like to see it be able to bake these with an Octane renderer or something like that, which is way faster. So we'll see. But all in all, like, decals are an important workflow nowadays, and we've got a workflow in MODO now.
Yum, yum!